Being Black in America comes with its challenges. However, we understand that enlightenment through education is the oppressor's worst fear. By bridging the gap between academia and the people, our purpose is to equip you with knowledge that breaks down barriers during your journey towards truth and freedom. Welcome to the Black and Highly Dangerous Podcast.
Yo, what's up?
Hello there. How are you?
What's up, Daph? I'm good. I'm excited. You know why I'm excited, Daph?
Why are you excited, Daph?
Because this is episode number 1.
Yeah, I'm like pretty excited too.
Yeah.
It's like having a classroom like with thousands of people that you don't see. So it's not as scary as standing in front of the classroom as a teacher.
That is true. And we definitely want to thank our listeners. Thank you all for tuning in to our very first episode. And we hope that you tune in to every episode after that. I'm going to give you all a round of applause. About y'all, this is definitely not possible.
Pat yourself on the back.
Anything new with you, Daph?
You know, honestly, I just moved back to the Midwest after being in Boston for the past 4 years. So, you know, I was kind of going back and forth for a long time, but I've officially settled in the Midwest again. So that's pretty exciting.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Not a big fan of the Midwest, so good luck to you.
Yeah, thank you. I actually put together a really nice home office that I'm sitting in right now. So that's pretty exciting as well.
Yeah, home office is always nice. I got one of those too.
What about you? Anything new going on with you?
Not much. Start classes tomorrow, spring semester. So just been finishing up the prep and getting the syllabi ready and answering students' questions via email. I'm excited. I'm teaching a new course, Race, Crime, and Punishment. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, that'll be
first
fun.
First time teaching that. So yeah, I'm just excited about that.
Yeah. Do you have any of those students that like email you like 3-4 weeks in advance? I used to be one of those students, you know, make
it's
good
funny when you're on the other side of them and your perspective change when you're on the other side and you're like one of them, you know, high achieving students, and then you're the professor viewing these high achieving students. But yeah, I get those students that one student emailed me and wanted to get the readings for like 3 weeks from now, which I don't even know what they are yet, but you know. She wanted them to get a head start. I
applaud her. Go ahead, girl.
Definitely. Do your thing. Got to make me step up my game. About to expose me out here in these streets. So I guess tell me a story of experience you've had with police that you felt, I don't know, that was an issue or, you know, that stands out to you, an encounter. I'm sure we all have those. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for the most part, like growing up, I really didn't have like many run-ins with the police. Like I can remember like one time being pulled over, and oftentimes they would see like my books in the back seat of my car or something like that. And I would like go home or something like that. So I can say in my hometown, I really never had any issues, but it was actually when I moved to Indiana for graduate school that like with them moving there, like I got pulled over like 3 or 4 times, like probably like just the summer or the first year I lived there. And that isn't typical for me. And yeah, oftentimes I wouldn't receive a ticket. I would only receive a warning, but it wasn't until I talked to a friend of mine who happened to be white, and they were like, yeah, that's not normal. I never get pulled over. And I was like, But
all your stops in Indiana, you know, were they all just smooth, or was there, you know, had there any crazy things that happened?
Well, actually, yeah, there was one in particular. I was on my midnight grind. I was burning the midnight oil, as my daddy would say. Okay. I was in a computer lab on campus. They were the only computer lab that had like the statistical software I needed to prep for my exam the next day. And I was there with another friend. And we were there probably like to 2:30 in the morning. something. And we decided to like follow each other home. We lived in the same apartment complex, but we were in different cars. And so we had a little drive home, and we wanted to be safe and follow each other. Well, she makes a right hand turn. And when I make the exact same turn, as a cop is coming, not in the opposite direction, but he was like turning left off of the street that we were turning right onto. So it's kind of like we were like T, kind of like like a T. Yeah. And so it was just so weird because as soon as I turned, he like bust a U-turn, and I was like, oh shit, or sorry for my language, but I was like, I don't know why he turned around. So he kind of follows me for one block and then turns on his light. I'm like, okay, I don't know what could have happened, but whatever. And the thing that struck out to me the most is when he parked behind me, he literally parked at an angle to where his lights were like on high beams and they were in my mirror. So as soon as I looked to see him like coming so I could roll down my windows, like I was kind of like blinded, like the light was so like bright. And then so I just sit there for a minute waiting for him to knock on my window, as what usually happens. But all of a sudden, like my passenger side door swings open and he yells something. I can't even remember, but I literally screamed. I had never been that freaking afraid in my life. And I honestly started freaking out. Like I started crying and I was just like, why did you do that? Like, are you supposed to do that? Like what? And he was like, give me your license, give me your registration, like give me those things. And like as I was reaching for it, he was like, did you even have on your seatbelt? I'm like, you just saw me unbuckle my seatbelt. Like what the hell? And so I'm like freaking out and crying. I can't find my insurance because I'm just like so frazzled. And I was just like, why did you do that? He was like, well, I came to your driver's side, but he claimed that I didn't respond to him on the day. Something. He made up some lame lie, but like he never like came to my driver's side. He never like tried to like get my attention and just didn't get it and therefore needed to open my door. He probably thought like, I gotcha. And when he saw me freaking out, he then called for like backup. And like they started, and I was like, is that the proper protocol? When backup came and they were like, is your dad an officer or something? And I was like, what does that have to do with anything? I guess my language about like protocol and stuff like that kind of startled them. What's crazy is that after all of that, he let me go with warnings.
Wow.
And he pulled me over because he said I did not signal my right hand turn. Mm-hmm. Okay. But all of that over, I believe I signaled my right hand turn, but all of that over a right hand turn. I went home and I literally like cried for like 2 hours, and I had an exam that next morning at like 8 or 9 o'clock. And my professor, he later found out about it through someone else. I guess we lived in a small town, so like the word got around, and he was like, you should not have come in that morning. Like you could have like spoken to me. I would have like excused you, because I was up to like 4 or 5, just like distraught. But I still aced that exam. But I mean, that's the type of thing that could have weighed heavy on me and caused me to freaking fail the exam.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, that definitely sounds like a traumatic experience, man. And I think I remember hearing about that when we were at Purdue. And
yeah, you even like it was Utah that was like, we need to go like make a complaint.
Yeah, that's how I feel like just, because in those situations, I just feel like when people experience those things, you just feel so helpless, right? You can be taken advantage of in many ways. And then afterwards, you're not only traumatized and emotionally distraught, but it's like, you feel powerless. I can't do anything about it, or nothing can happen. And I always try to tell people, there's always something, even if you feel like it's not going to work, at least you felt like you did something. And that kind of brings me about to a story that happened, and you were there at this particular time. And to put a little background information, during my graduate school days, I was always the guy that always had people over and have a good time and hang out, in my apartment. And I stayed at the same apartment for 6 years. And I remember this night in particular because I had a group of friends over because it was for election night for Obama's second term. And so we were all coming over to hang out, have a few drinks, and look and see if, Obama was actually going to win. And I've had previous kickbacks and get-togethers in the past in my apartment. And just so you know, I had a neighbor downstairs who pretty much hated my guts for some reason. I mean, she would call the cops on me for the most smallest infractions. One time she called the cops on me for vacuuming my apartment. It was just me up there, me and my dog, and I was cleaning my apartment and vacuuming. And the cops came to me and said, we're getting a noise of you vacuuming. And I said, yes, I'm cleaning my apartment. And I'm like, there's nothing I can do. And the police officer actually asked me if I could turn my vacuum cleaner down, which I just thought was ridiculous. And I kind of laughed in his face. And I think after he asked it, he kind of realized that was a pretty dumb question. But regardless, this night of the election, we had people over. And again, I've had police officers come to my apartment a few times for noise complaints, largely because my neighbor downstairs didn't like me. And they usually would come to the door, ask me to come outside, ask me to have an ID, ask me if this is my apartment. Of course, I would say, yes, this is my apartment. We're just having a few friends over, we're all of age. And they would just say, hey, can you, politely, can you keep the noise down? We just have to come here. It's no biggie, there's no issues. And I'll be like, okay, cool, no problem. And then after they would leave, I would make sure that, we kind of kept it down so that they didn't have to return. But on this particular night, Obama had won, and I know we got kind of riled up and everybody was excited and making noise and cheering. So unsurprisingly, the police officer comes. But on this particular night, this police officer, again, he was a white male, and he was just of a different breed compared to the other interactions I've had with police officers. I opened the door, I went to the door, and then immediately he's starting asking questions like, what's going on here? And he looks in the door, and of course he sees a bunch of black and brown folk all in the apartment. And so usually, I'm about to step outside because that's what I'm used to doing when the police officers come. So I'm like, okay, I'm about to step outside. And he immediately backs up and puts his hands up like, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm about to step outside to talk to you. This is my place. He's like, no, I didn't say step outside. And then I'm like, okay. He's like, stay where you are. And I'm, of course, in the door. And then he puts his foot in between the door. And he's looking at everyone and talking to everyone. And I'm trying to tell him hey, man, let's just step outside. You know what I'm saying? We could talk about this. He proceeds to tell me to shut up. And puts his hand on his gun. And there are other, my friend who has a father who was a police officer started to point that out. Like, why do you have your hand on your gun? We're not threatening to you. I don't understand what's going on here. And you can tell initially that he really thought it was a kind of party because you saw a bunch of black kids, that were there and didn't realize. And then I know one of my friends, he proceeded to tell him hey, we're all PhD students here. We're not the kind of stereotypical people you're probably imagining us to be. And then I think we had another friend that started to record. And once she started to record, his demeanor immediately changed. And he started to talk in a softer tone, was a little bit more respectful, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, I didn't like the way that went down. And so I told him I was going to report him. And so the next day I went to the police department and I filed a report. And what most people should know is a lot of times the police, when you talk to the superior, they'll want to do kind of an informal report where you complain to them and they'll say to you, don't worry about it. I'll talk to him about it. If that's what you want, we can do it one or two ways. I'll just talk to him about it. He won't do it again. Or you can file a formal report and then internal affairs to get involved. And I was like, I want to file an internal report. He tried to talk me out of it. And the reason I wanted to do that is because regardless of the situation, regardless of the outcome, he was going to have that on his record, right? So if he goes up for promotion, if he goes up for anything, at least I did my part as a citizen to formalize that and actually say, if he ever did anything crazy again, that there was going to be a report of this police officer's misconduct. So eventually I reported it. I got a couple weeks later, a letter in the mail from IA, Internal Affairs, saying, they didn't find anything of wrongdoing. Okay. Move forward a couple weeks later, have a couple more friends over, police get called again. This time it is the same officer, but he has a shadow with him. Okay. He has a little buddy, another officer. And in this time, he actually did what he was supposed to do, the proper protocol. He asked, can I step outside? He asked for my ID. He asked me, is this my apartment? I said, yes. He asked if I could keep it down. I said, yes. And then he kept it. He moved along his way, which I felt was a major victory on my end, because he had to come back to my apartment, do what he was supposed to do, and readdress me in the proper fashion. So even though I didn't find anything, they still provided him with a buddy, a shadow, to make sure he did everything correctly. And he corrected his behavior next time when he came to see me. So even though there was not a formal change, the informal changes did happen. He did act accordingly, right? So I think that's what people should also know, is that even if you feel like there might not be the situation might not have the exact outcome, right? This person may not get fired or fined or suspended, but these formal complaints do make change in smaller ways once that's on their record. So Indiana did have some crazy things going on with the police, to say the least.
And hearing your story, I don't think I ever followed up about like what happened with your complaint, but I still to this day, okay, that incident probably happened like 5 or 6 years ago, and it still sticks with me. You get what I'm saying? Like it like cause scars, and I'm a little regretful and probably disappointed that I didn't file a formal complaint, because I think it's just so easy to like get into the mindset that like nothing is going to happen, or I'm too busy, like, you know, it's just a waste of time. And it's just kind of like, even if nothing happened, like that could have been the one thing that I did. And so I'm kind of regretful that I didn't file a report about my incident. Yeah.
But hey, this is called life. You know, we all live and learn through experiences. And then if it happens again, hopefully it never happens again, I think you would definitely, you know, feel more empowered, right, to make a report or something along those lines.
Definitely.
But enough about our experiences. I think we can move forward into, you know, discussing policing in this country a little bit more generally in today's featured topic.
Listening to your story and thinking about my own story or stories that I see in the media, there seem to be, or one thing that's happening that's starting to like change things is like recordings and like social media. And you talked about how the officer changed his demeanor like after the recording started. And I'm really interested in like just trying to figure out like what do you think, what do you think contributes to that behavior? Like, how do we get here to like this current state where there's like almost a sense of invincibility on one end, maybe even fear on both sides? Like, how do we get here? Like, yeah.
All right. So, yeah, that reminds me when we talk about like policing and kind of the state we're in and almost this conversation around power, it reminds me of a study, the Stanford prison experiment, which you probably heard of in like intro to psychology class, intro to sociology class. And in this experiment, a guy by the name of Philip Zimbardo created a prison in the basement of a building, and he had 24 males, right, to kind of enact or become the roles of inmates or prisoners and guards or officers. The study was supposed to last for 14 days. It only wound up lasting about 6 days, if I can remember correctly. The reason why it was cut short is because of what happened and what ensued when these college students who volunteered took these roles as officers and inmates. And one of the, I guess, more compelling findings is that the officers began to become really entrenched with their power. They began to abuse their power. They began to abuse the inmates and have them do ridiculous things to prove their authority. Okay. And the transformation happened within a day or so, that quickly. And the inmates began to experience a lot of psychological trauma and breakdown as well, where in some interviews still have lasting effects today from this experiment, which is why it's still brought up on questions of ethics when you're talking about experimentation and stuff like that in psychology. But the idea of it is that being in that role, right, these were normal college students, no really differences in power or authority, but being presented and given that role completely changed their behavior within a couple of days. And I think this experiment can speak to somewhat the nature of policing of what we see. Having uniform, having a role does change how you are expected to be perceived, right? How you're expected to be respected. And if you're expected to have this power with just college students, right? How would they change in 2 or 3 days? Imagine what it can do to an institution or a body of people. And so I think drawing from lessons of that experiment, we can see that having certain kind of powers, having a uniform, being in a role can be influential in how people treat each other in a lot of ways, right? In those power dynamics. And I think that's a big part of what's being discussed, or the issue is with policing, because I mean, we'll talk about the race kind of stuff in a second, but in my classes, when I talk to students or I ask the question, how many of you are afraid or nervous or anxious when a police officer approach you? 9 times out of 10, probably about 98% of the class always raises their hand. Right. So it's not just a black or white thing. It's this general feeling of policing in the country where when someone is encountering or interacting with a police officer, most of the time they're going to be scared. They're going to be anxious. They're going to be nervous, concerned in some fashion. It's not like a pleasant feeling when a police officer's in their space. And so I think that also has to be addressed as well. And I wonder if police officers know that, right? When they are interacting with people, do they understand that most of the time when they're interacting with people that they are coming from a place of fear instead of a place of comfort, right? I'm not sure. All police officers probably don't intend for that to happen, but I think that's the dynamic and the relationship we're beginning to see between citizens and police officers in this country.
It's funny that you say that, because it seems like in a lot of cases where officers take on like a certain type of, I guess, demeanor, a very like strong or negative demeanor, especially with like some people in some communities. When you hear about like maybe explanations or excuses for the behavior after the fact, or, from people who kind of attempt to defend like officers or, very bad behavior, they often bring up officers' fear, their potential fear, like, they're afraid of their lives every day, and it's interesting because, I can understand like you're on the job, every interaction, has the potential to go left. So that's kind of understandable, but you are in a position of authority and you can't allow your fear to turn into bias or allow bias and fear to interact in ways that really cause harm to like certain communities on a regular basis. And it's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like we control our emotions and try to control our like interactions with police officers despite the fear that we face. And of course, this is not all officers, but at least in those incidents that we see where it's like, this is clearly wrong, it seems like fear is often a factor in the officer's behavior. And it's kind of like they need to equally be held accountable for like, keeping that fear in check, especially when there is no threat to them.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things to that point, right? One is that I know there's this popular video kind of after the Ferguson stuff happened, where there was an activist who went to do pretty much police training. They were recording it and they say, here's a gun, go do, they put them in these certain scenarios, of course, to say, hey, put yourself in the officer's shoes and see what happens. Of course, the activist failed, was shooting unarmed people, getting shot, all this kind of stuff. And they tried to use that as an example to be like, hey, see what happens as officer is not that easy. Of course, I think most people are not saying being a police officer is easy, but I think the problem with how they try to deliver that message is anything is hard if you're not familiar with it. Nobody just picks up a gun and says, I'm a police officer and knows how to operate in these kind of situations. They're trained for weeks, for months, right? And even throughout their experience as a police officer to how to handle these situations. situations. If I'm a professor, if I tell a police officer to come in and teach a class of 100 students, of course that would be hard for them. Of course they'll probably do a bad job at first and not be good in it because they're not trained in it. They don't have experience, right? So I don't think people can just take that one example and run with it and be like, see how hard police officers' jobs are? They are hard. We agree with that. But at the same time, you are a trained professional, so it shouldn't be that difficult in a lot of regard. And I think the second part to your point about the fear aspect is how realistic is that fear, right? I think a lot of people don't ask themselves that deeper question. Yes, policing is a dangerous job, but you can Google this yourselves. Anybody can, right? Google the top 10 dangerous jobs in America. On not one list will you find police officers, right? On not one list. Most of the time it's roofing, it's construction, being a taxi driver, right? Being a police officer is not the top 10 jobs in this country. Even to dig a little deeper into that, okay? There are estimates from about, well, people say 1 million to about 765,000 police officers in this country. Okay. So we'll use the more conservative estimate of 765,000. Out of 765,000 sworn officers in the year of 2016, I want to preface this by saying that I don't take deaths lightly on any regard, whether it's an unarmed black male, whether it's a police officer, but I'm just really highlighting this point to show and demonstrate, provide perspective. That's all I'm trying to do of what actually are people are. Is there a real reality of being fearful, right? So out of the 765,000 sworn officers in this country, in the year 2016, there were 135 officers killed on duty. Okay, 135. That is 0.017% of officers that were killed on duty. Right now, again, these officers gave their lives. We're very appreciative to what they're done. Again, I'm not taking this lightly, but I am providing perspective on the danger. Out of that 135 officers killed, 64 died from gun-related deaths. Okay, the year before, 41 had died. Okay, and that was actually the lowest amount of police deaths in history in 2015. 64 died from gun-related deaths. 53 of those officers died from traffic-related issues, right? You're on a traffic stop, you get hit by a passing car, you're chasing a car, things like that, traffic-related instances. And then 18 have died from other causes, mainly illnesses such as heart attacks. Okay, so putting that in perspective, right? So way less than 1% of policing less than 1% chance do you have of a police officer to actually die on duty. Okay. So when you put that in perspective, to walk around with this fear that you're going to die, that your life is constantly in danger. Yes, you're in dangerous situations, but the reality in this country of you actually dying is a very small percentage compared to other types of jobs, right? And so I think we put too much onus on just the reality of it happening, right? And I think that's where this kind of gets lost in conversation. That I think most citizens do agree that policing, I myself agree that policing is a dangerous job, is a needed job, but I'm also trying to provide a lens to say, let's look at the reality of how dangerous is it. Now, if somebody's saying a job is that dangerous, I expect to see less than 1%, right, of these type of injuries, maybe 10%, maybe 15%, hundreds, thousands of deaths, right? But that's just not the case here. And that's just the reality that policing is essentially, in terms of fatal death, a safe job, right? Not as dangerous as we think it to be in a lot of ways.
So, what you just said, it kind of makes me think of research. I'll have to look up the name that shows like what we focus our attention on, like what we are constantly thinking about. It shapes our behavior, even in ways that are not conscious. So if I'm constantly thinking about, oh my God, like I am walking up to this car, this person looks this way, they're probably dangerous, that's going to impact my interactions with them. And it seems like, kind of based on the statistics, not saying that, any police officer should completely like let their guard down, but it seems like they need to like become a little bit more conscious of like what they are thinking, how realistic those thoughts of danger are, and whether those thoughts are potentially motivated by stereotypes that they have of the person that they are interacting with or are about to interact with. So it's kind of like, implicit bias. Implicit bias interacting with these like not even self-fulfilling, because when you look at the statistics, but it's like self-fulfilling in the sense that I am constantly on guard and I am, forever just kind of like ready to pounce because I believe my life is in imminent danger. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the implicit bias test, and we could put the link on the website for you all to listen to. Not to listen to, but to try out when this episode airs, so you can see what we're talking about. And most of the time with the implicit bias test is that, bias test is that most people generally feel that people of color are more dangerous, right? They have, even though they may not consciously admit to it or feel that way, when they're put in these situations when they have to think quickly, and you'll see on these implicit bias tests, they are generally skewing towards more people of color when it comes to things like dangerousness and fear. So Daphne, I have a question for you. When people say things like the criminal justice system or policing is racist, do you believe that?
So I think whenever you talk about like racism, even like generally, I feel like I have a professor who always says that like racism is it's like a loaded gun. Like once you shoot it, or once it's out there, like it just causes chaos in a sense. But I think people need to learn how to distinguish between like calling a person racist and calling a system racist. I believe there are racist police officers, just like there are racist people in probably every profession. Do I think all police officers are racist? No. Do I think many have implicit biases? Yes. Things that they might not even be aware of. Do I think the system of so-called justice in the United States is racist? Yeah, I do. I mean, let's read some Michelle Alexander. It's interesting because I was a teaching fellow for a class this semester where I'll have to put the book link up, but we read a book that actually talked about how even like going like beyond like what Michelle Alexander talked about in the new Jim Crow, like there like after like during Reconstruction, there were laws created for the express purposes of like vagrancy laws. Like if a black man was walking without and they didn't have money in their pocket, then the police officers or constables or whatever, they could accuse them of being vagrants or jobless and therefore put them in jail. Or what often happened is that they would arrest them. A plantation or like a farmer, a white farmer would actually pay for them to get out, and they would be forced to like work off that debt for so many months. So it was essentially slavery by another name, and that's actually the name of the book, Slavery by Another Name. And we can post that, but it's just kind of like our system of policing is rooted in racism, and that's just a fact. It doesn't mean every police officer is racist or every judge or every DA or whatever. It just means the way the system was created, it was created based on a desire to harass and just I agree. I don't know what else to say.
I agree. I think there are a lot of words in our society, especially in today's time, where we'll look at like racism. Race is a trigger word, and once people hear it, they get turned off and not really try to understand what it's meaning. And when people hear organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement say racist or racism or racist institutions or policing is racist, I think many people are incorrectly using it in a way by saying, oh, they're saying all police officers are racist, right? And using it in an individual sense where they think that organizations like the Black Lives Matter movement is saying police officers are waking up every day saying, oh, I'm going to lock me up a black person today. Or I'm going to shoot a black person today. No, I don't believe that, right? Like you said, I do believe that there are, without a doubt, some racist police officers, right? Some police officers who actually probably do intentionally, consciously target black people and communities of color specifically because they dislike them, because they're biased, etc. They do have an agenda. But largely, I think most people wake up every day to just try to do the job the best they can. But on the other end, I am a firm believer, like you said as well, that the system itself is racist by oppressing a particular group institutionally and systemically, right? When we say this, we're saying that a system can continuously perpetuate or operate in a fashion that is creating inequalities solely based off of race, right? And you can have sexist institutions, you can have classist institutions, etc., that are using these categories to define or exercise particular practices that do keep one race or one group of people in a position of privilege or power and another group in vulnerable positions and oppressed in many ways. And so I think policing is a proponent of that, because if you look at majority of policing research, you will see that they, as far as the enforcement aspect, people of color are just treated way more unfairly and unequal compared to their white counterparts, from police stops, from traffic stops to sentencing, to sentence lengths, to convictions, all the above, right? There's a wealth of research that really highlights that fact. And I think people have to look at and understand history too, because when you talk about race in this country, you have to realize that most of the things that were created really started on the foundation of being racist. For instance, most people don't understand that policing in its earliest forms, right, were started as slave patrols in the South, primarily in places like South Carolina, where police officers, they weren't really police officers, they were called slave patrols, and their sole duty was to look for black men and women who they thought were runaway slaves or did not have their papers. That was their only purpose, not to do anything else, to do with anything with white people, other people in the community. They were just patrolling and looking for random black people, right? So the history of policing had began on this premise of looking and profiling people based off of race. And then we slowly built off of that foundation. So you're still going to have many of those kind of instances within the DNA of this institution of policing. And I think we see that with things like stop and frisk as an example, right? Which was deemed unconstitutional, which was largely in New York City because, you know, blacks made up, people of color made up about 50% or less than 50% of the population. Whites made up just about half or over half of the population. But as far as who was getting stopped, 86% of the stops in stop and frisk were blacks and Latinos, right? So that's a clear demonstration that you can't just say based off demographics, based off population, oh, police officers are only stopping people in their community. No, percentage wise, demographics wise, it just didn't add up. They were stopping mainly young black and brown men more than anybody else, and multiple times, 86% of the time, right? I mean, those numbers you just can't deny. And this is how, when you're saying things are racist, that means it's not being applied fairly. If it wasn't a racist institution, or if it was being applied fairly, we would see about an even number of stops, or at least on the same lines of the proportion, right? At least 50% of the stops would be white people, or even more, right? Because it's just more white people compared to blacks and Latinos, but we didn't see that, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I feel like it's an easy cop out to say like, oh, you know, that's just the population. Of course, I'm going to pull over black people. Like that's the population where I serve. But it's just kind of like black communities, Latino communities, communities of color are over policed. And therefore you know, people, you know, like to use statistics incorrectly. So they, you know, might say like, oh, you know, black people or Latino people commit these crimes more. And it's like, no, you know, it typically you might see higher reporting within a particular demographic because they're a higher level of policing and stopping. So I think one statistic that I actually heard about was kind of like marijuana. Like black and white people used marijuana at the same rates, but it was kind of like the arrest and kind of like convictions for like marijuana crimes disproportionately impacted like the Black community. It's kind of like, okay, everybody's smoking at the same rates, but we're not experiencing the same level of policing around it. And actually, that's why a lot of people have recently talked about just like the racism that is embedded within like this new system of like, decriminalizing marijuana and like, making it available for recreational use and sale. And it's kind of like, who's profiting from that now? Who's still in jail over like petty marijuana crimes, when, everybody's enjoying at the same rate. And so like, those are the types of things. Like if everybody's doing the same thing at the same rate, we should kind of expect it to be proportional to like the population, or at least, proportional, like as it relates to like the rates of incidents for like any particular like bad behavior or crime.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. And this kind of also, when we talk about instances like what happened with Michael Brown and Ferguson, and a lot of the times, again, a lot of people were saying, oh, the police system is racist, right? And some people saying, no, they're not. Some people saying, yes, they are, right? And so after there was a non-verdict, right, after Darren Wilson didn't go to trial, Eric Garner came in, U.S. Department of Justice, and all right, let's investigate. Let's see if there's any truth to what the citizens of Ferguson have been saying, the protesters have been saying. And what they did find was, in fact, that there was a lot of truth to what they were saying, right? Some of the things from this extensive report, when they're looking at the stops and the policing actions of the Ferguson Police Department, okay, Blacks made up 67% of the Ferguson population and accounted for 85% of traffic stops and 90% of citations and 93% of arrests from 2012 to 2014, okay? 93% of arrests, 67% of the population, right? Does not make any sense. Beyond that, African Americans were 2 times more likely to be searched during vehicle stops, but were 26%, this goes to the point that you were saying, Daphne, 26% less likely, okay, less likely to have contraband found on them compared to their white counterparts, okay? But also 2 times more likely to receive a citation, okay? I mean, they have a lot more. 88% of all cases, of cases where they had police use force was against African Americans, okay? So these are trends that we're seeing here. They even have emails in this report. I'll read a couple of emails from officials in Ferguson, right? What they found. There was an email in 2008 that stated when President Obama won the presidency, he said he wouldn't be president for very long because what Black man holds a steady job for 4 years, okay? There was another one where there was an email that showed President Obama as a chimpanzee, okay? There was another one, I'll just read one more, where it says an email described the man seeking to attain welfare for his dogs because they were mixed in color, unemployed, lazy, and couldn't speak English and have no freaking clue of who their daddies are, right? Again, this is not stuff that was made up. This is actual factual evidence that the people of Ferguson were saying, hey, even though the nation is coming together because of what happened to Michael Brown, we're sick and tired because this has been going on for us in our community for years, for decades. The history, how I talked about the history of slave patrols and policing, the history of Ferguson was once a sundown town, okay? And if you don't know what that is, look it up, Google it, all right? But it definitely has some strong racist and racial implications on how that city operated, and we saw all the way up until 2015. So that just goes to say, like, what we've been seeing in the news, in the media surrounding a lot of these police situations, there's a lot of facts to it. It's not just people saying, oh, we're mad at the police, or, the police, it's not this debate. It's not really a debate when you have all this kind of factual evidence. It's just truth. And it's now that we have this truth, are you going to recognize it? Are you going to try to move forward and correct it? Right. But I don't think we see a lot of that. It's such a polarizing topic that people just get on one side. But I think there's things to be said in order for us to bring together and move forward in this kind of situation, though.
I agree. And I feel like over the last few months, I have grown to appreciate history so much. I think a lot of people are just ignorant to the history behind a lot of things. And it's like, once you, because it seems like when things happen, it's kind of like, oh, that's a one-off thing. That just kind of happened. Why are you turning it into like this so-called, why are you trying to find a pattern where there is no pattern? But when you go back to the history of a lot of things and you see the connections and how they have like just resulted in cumulative advantages and disadvantages for certain populations. I think if we just paid more attention to the history, people might be more open to like accepting some of the things that we say as truth. And it's just kind of like, I don't know, after reading like a few extra history books and even like seeing things myself, it's kind of like these things are undeniable. But you have to be willing to either seek out the knowledge or, once someone tells you, just follow up on like what people say, like fact check us, like, everything we say, we're speaking from our academic experience and academic expertise. We've read a lot, but it's just kind of like, yeah, you don't have to take what we say at face value. Look at the books we cite, the articles we cite, the resources we cite, and you'll see like what we're saying is the truth. So I think that's one of the biggest things. It's kind of getting the truth out there, but also like helping people to just see the links between what's happening today and the history of things, so people can stop saying like, get over it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what do you think about, when we hear these situations that make national news, and we'll just stick with Ferguson for now, because I think that's a good reference point for us and our listeners. What do you think about the overall community response to these issues? Do you think they are adequate? How do you feel about it generally? Just when you see them happening and these issues with police and protesting, what are your thoughts on that?
So for me, like, I remember when Ferguson happened. I remember it like yesterday. It was my first year in my new graduate program. And I just remember being fired up in a way that I had never been fired up before. Like, I'm one of those people, I'm not necessarily like the person that's like at the front line. Like I have my lane. I like try to make change in my community in ways that feel authentic to me. Protesting had not historically been one of those ways, but when that happened, like, I was outraged. And I remember like that was like, it wasn't my first protest, but it was like I did one in high school, like related to like a local thing, but that was like my first protest like as an adult, where we like marched through the streets of Boston. Like, we were even about to take over the freeway, but the cops were like, no. But it was interesting. Like, we actually marched by like the local jail, and to like see like even the people in the windows, like in their cells, and I don't know, it was like a powerful moment for me. And I thought it was a beautiful response. But one thing that I have noticed, that like these incidents, they keep happening every week, hell, every couple days. I feel like there's something new. And I mean, it's cold now, so I really don't see people out there protesting at this moment. But it's interesting because it's like, I don't want people to become like desensitized to the issue. And it's kind of like, oh, there they go, outraged again, or there they go, like another protest. There's actually an article I read, and they talked about like protest fatigue, and they were talking about it in relation to like a science march that happened like last April. But I'm pretty sure, these findings can like, relate to like protests like around race or police brutality. But it kind of showed that like protests, like left-leaning individuals, when asked about like the potential like impact or effects of a protest, like 60% of like left-leaning, liberals and Democrats felt like, oh, it would make a difference. On the opposite end of the spectrum, right-leaning individuals and Republicans, 60% of them said that like these protests protest or march, would it make any difference? And so it's kind of like goes back to like a initial thought or comment I had, like, are protests speaking to the choir? Like, are we just doing this for ourselves? Like, I feel like they make a statement. Absolutely. Are they making the difference that we need? Not so sure. So I feel like protests definitely make a statement. I have questions about the difference they're making in this era.
Yeah, I agree. I think I feel that on one end, protests, of course, I guess I can say protests are not the end all be all, right? I think no one should really well, it depends on the protest too, but protest is to really make people uncomfortable, I think. And two, to spark conversation, because most of the time protests stem from people not having conversation, right? And so when you have these instances, it's forcing people to talk about it, whether the media is covering it, whether it's disrupting somebody from going to work, whether it's, somebody can't, back in the day, you couldn't get your trash taken from your corner of your house, right? So it's forcing people to address an issue, talk about an issue. But again, I think what you're saying is that it's not enough to get us to really see the change we want. But I think it is a good first step. But I also think one of the ideas of protests stem from kind of even what you were talking about before when you heard about, what happened in Ferguson, how upset you were, and having that ability to protest and be with other people is also therapeutic in a lot of ways to a community that might have been traumatized, or to just people who are really upset about it and feel like they need to do something or they're going to explode. I think protests are or can be used as this kind of therapeutic instrument to help people get those feelings out, right? Be around other people like themselves who feel the same way and get that kind of experience that helps them move forward, right? And think a little bit more clearly and also have conversations. And this is something I kind of talk to my students about. I won't get into too much detail, but again, this is a conversation that comes up in conversation when we've seen the protests in Ferguson and other places. And then the question is, why are people rioting? Why do they have to riot? And this is kind of a whole other conversation, but kind of keeping it centered around protests. There's a guy by the name of Tyrell who's been doing research since the 90s. And his research is along the lines of what is called procedural justice. And it's being used a lot with policing and trying to figure out ways how communities can build better trust between police and citizens. And what procedural justice says ultimately is this: before this type of research, the idea was that a person was only satisfied with their treatment of, say, a police officer. Say a police officer stops me and the police officer didn't give me a ticket. I would look at that, looking back at that experience and that situation with the police officer, I would look at that as a favorable experience, and I would rate it very high, right? Because the outcome was that I didn't get a ticket. And this was most of the belief before procedural justice research began to take front, was that outcome was the only important factor, is whether or not people were going to be satisfied with the system or not. Tom Tyler's research said, I don't think that's the case. I think the way people are treated is more important, or just as important, as the outcome. And so with his research, what he found was that there are 4 primary components to what people look at when they're getting treated. It's, do they have a voice in the process? Are they treated with respect and dignity? Is the power figure, authority, is the police officer neutral? Is he not biased, or her, is she not biased? And also, are their motives trustworthy? Are they doing what they're doing for the right reasons, right? Are they doing it just for some kind of malicious intent? And what he found was, and what has been consistent over the past couple of decades with the research, is that having a voice in the process is one of the most important things. Being able to just speak your side is important. And most of the time when people are able to speak their side and the outcome is still not what they wanted, right? They still may have gotten that ticket, but they were at least able to talk to the officer and explain to them why they did not, use their turn signal, or why they were speeding. They would still feel that the experience and that they were treated well and that they were treated fairly, right? So that's a big part, having a voice. And when we look at the criminal justice system, to me, and we've been seeing what's been happening in these cases, and again, we'll stick with Ferguson, is that as we already kind of discussed, the history of what was going on, the treatment of the people in Ferguson was going unheard. They did not have a voice. And it got to the point where a member of their community had died, right? An unarmed child in their community had died in the hands of a police officer, and it was a boiling point. They were frustrated. They were fed up, right? And so they began to protest to kind of provide that voice. Like, we're going to be heard now since you have not heard us at all throughout any kind of formal processes when it's regard to the criminal justice system. And I think also what happens, and this is where I think a lot of the anger and frustration and rioting comes, is that you also have to trust the system. And so many people were trusting the fact that, hey, Darren Wilson is at least going to have his day in court, and that Michael Brown's voice, Michael Brown's family, Michael Brown's community will also have their voice heard in this kind of formal system in court. What winds up happening, and which we see in many of these cases, and you can look at the trend in many of these cases, is that they put it in grand jury, and I can talk about that in a little bit, but most of these cases don't even go to trial, right? They don't even go to trial to at least have the evidence that are presented, that we heard in the news, that we heard in the media, be fleshed out in court, and then a decision being made. So therefore, essentially what you're doing is you're taking away the entire voice of a community, right? Through the formal process of the criminal justice system. You're saying, hey, if you're mad about it, all right, let's take it to court and see what really happens. If Darren Wilson is right, then we should at least go to court and see if it's true. But when you don't even go to court, that is one of the most frustrating things. Saying we're mad, we're frustrated, we're hurt, and we want our day in court, and the system is saying, no, we're not going to allow you to have your voice heard at all, right? And then this is why I think a lot of times now we've relied on the system. We said, okay, you told us to wait for a court trial. You're not giving us that court trial. So why should I give a damn about the system anymore, right? Why should I give a damn about these stores anymore? Why should I give a damn about this police car anymore, right? I might as well continue to break the law, because the law, when we're trying to follow it, still doesn't work in our favor. We still don't get our voices heard, even after all this protesting, after all this media coverage, after losing a life, after all the stories and narratives, you still are saying that we still don't deserve a day in court. And so I think when you have all that kind of buildup, it's easy to see why you have young kids begin to loot or set cars on fire or express this frustration and anger in other ways because their voice has been taken from them. I don't think people provide or looking at that perspective or that context, and they just see the imagery and they say, oh, they're bad, how they destroying their community. But I don't think they're looking at why they're doing it, right? All that frustration and think about, like you said, Daph, you felt that, and you were in Boston. You're not even from Ferguson. You didn't even know Michael Brown. So think of the people in that community who knew Michael Brown, who experienced this police brutality and racism, right? And then goes through all of that, and they can't still express themselves or have their day in court. You can imagine why I would be pissed off. I would be mad. I'd be angry. I'd be wanting to turn some cars over, right? It's the right thing to do. But no, when you're that emotionally involved, I think it makes sense why people would react in that way. And I think that gets lost in conversation a lot of the times.
Yeah,
too.
I definitely agree. So kind of thinking about what you said, especially like drawing on that work, like how do we make our voices heard? How do we change the system so that we get justice?
That's a good question. One way, and I'll just stick with policing in general, right? And I think this is one of the first steps that many people should begin to address, is when we look at police training. I'll put up the link on the website for you all to look at as well. Again, this is data from the U.S. Department of Justice. This is not stuff I just make up on my own. Discoverpolicing.org. And what they do is they have a breakdown of policing agencies from across the country. They have 71 state academies, 307 college or university academies, and 286 local police precincts. And what they did is they tallied up the training hours of all of these precincts, and they put it in a chart and see how much time is spent on what type of training. And what you would see when you look at this chart is that majority of the hours are spent on weapons and defensive tactics, use of force, etc. Okay, 60 hours on defensive tactics, 71 hours on firearm skills, 21 hours on use of force. These are averages from all this data collected, and 16 hours on non-lethal weapons. Again, part of this conversation too, right? Of course, if you're going to use a lethal weapon, officers should be very, very much trained, right? But like we said before, with any kind of relationship, if you're trying to build the trust between the community and the police, any relationship, you can't do it without talking or being able to effectively communicate. And so when we look at how much time is spent on communication type trainings, okay, we see 49 hours are spent on their health and fitness. Okay, they should be in shape. 8 hours are spent on ethics and integrity. Could be problematic there. Communications, 15 hours on communications. Okay, professionalism, 11 hours on professionalism. And as we kind of said earlier on this episode, right, that police officers may have a lot of stress. Their jobs may be dangerous. Only 6 hours on stress prevention and management. All right. I'm not making this stuff up. So the things that we as a society want to see more of, police officers are getting trained the least. Okay. And so think of it as playing a sport. When you're in a situation where you have to rely on instinct, when you have to rely on skills, right? So if I'm playing basketball and I know how to shoot this particular jump shot, right? This fadeaway, and it's clutch time in the game, and I have to go to my go-to move, and I have to go off what I do with my instinct, what I practice the most, I'm going to go to that jump shot that I do very well, right? So think of it the same thing with training with police officers. I think we're seeing a lot of these shootings because when they get in these situations, they're going to the natural instinct of what they've been taught the most, and that's firearm skills. That's not de-escalation and communications. That's not professionalism. It's not stress management of what to do in the perceived threatening situation, right? It's use of force and firearm skills and defensive tactics. So it's not surprising when you see how they're getting trained, when we see that how it's actually getting played out in the communities of why police officers are going to this first, because that's how they're being trained. So I think that's the first step, is that we begin to need 65%. People don't understand 65% of policing is patrolling. That means you are interacting with people every day. So that means communications with not just people who are like you, but also unlike you, is probably one of the most important things that they should be learning of how to do that. But they don't. So you don't have effective communication, and then you get in issues or times where you have to, rely on instinct, and your instinct is how to pull out your gun and shoot it more than it is how to talk to someone politely and de-escalate a situation. So I definitely think that's the first step.
Kind of along those same lines, I want to see more police officers of color. And that's not to say that like every Black or Latino police officer is going to be understanding and going to have like a connection to the community and try to police in like responsible ways. But there is something about, you kind of mentioned like the interactions and the connections and the communications. There is something about having like a shared identity that might make communication just a bit easier. It could even like potentially like, reduce tension or stress around a possible interaction. I can say living in Atlanta, when I used to live in Atlanta, I got pulled over like once. I think he gave me a ticket, but I just didn't worry. And it's just kind of like my interactions were like always like friendly. It was interesting because like so much of the police force was like Black, and I don't know. I didn't feel like I was riding around like constantly afraid. Like one time I didn't see the police officer, and I like made like a U-turn like in the middle of a street, and like he was in the middle of the street trying to like, calm traffic down or something like that. And he stopped me. He could have been like my dad's age. And he was like, "Don't let me see you do that again." I was like, "Okay, I'm sorry." And like, he just kind of let me go. But it was just kind of like, that was like a positive interaction. Like he saw I was clearly in the wrong, but like it was like a caring interaction with somebody that was like, "Girl, don't let me see you do that again." I'm like, "Okay, I won't." And it's kind of like, I don't know. It's just something about, it's kind of like even having teachers that like have a similar background to you. Like sometimes there's a connection. So I would like to see more diversity in the police force.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even with that, people have to be careful, because if you become part of a system and you're not, and you can't just, a lot of times I think that is the response. We need more Black officers or officers of color in a lot of regards. And I think that does help a lot, especially, but I think the institution has to allow those officers to be diverse as well. I think what we see a lot of is that they put these police officers there and then make them still bleed blue, right? And not allow them to be the diverse selves that they are, right? If you're going to be Black and you're from a particular community and you know how to interact and communicate with people, allow them to do that, right? And that's why they're there, not to do it the way that you say they're supposed to do it. And so a lot of times officers, I think, that may be trying to use their diversity to help the institution of policing, they may get looked down upon or ostracized within their own community because they're not doing it the correct police way, quote unquote. I'm putting air quotes up for those of you who I know can't see me.
Yeah. I agree. I think also like there has to be some like changes like in the way that we as a community attempt to like create change, I feel like there's often this misconception about the importance of like local politics. I think we often get like riled up to create change around national election time, but we don't really pay attention to how local politics literally shape every single aspect of our lives. Like even more so than like, you know, at a national level, like our country is built on a system that's states' rights. And like there are a lot of things that are controlled and handled at a more local level. And so, you know, Ferguson has been like a theme throughout, you know, this entire episode. And there was actually a lot of disappointment last year when the citizens of Ferguson re-elected James Knowles, like the mayor that was there under, you know, when the Mike Brown situation happened. And I think what was so disappointing about that is when Ferguson first happened, like I said, I'm not necessarily a protest person, but I'm a strategizer. So like, you know, when I found out the demographics of Ferguson, and like the first thing I thought about was like, wow, like they have the potential to create change in the community because like they are the majority. They can elect who they want and need to elect. And so like that's where I saw like the first opportunity for change, like at the local level, elections kicking people out and getting new people in. And I think I was really disappointed to find out that Knowles was reelected and that he won by 422 votes in a town that has more than 24,000 residents, and about 70% of them are Black. So that was a little disappointing. Like I read an article from The Root, and it said that even if every white person in Ferguson voted for James Knowles, he would have still needed 40% of the Black vote in order to win. So it isn't even about like eligibility or like voter intimidation, because at least there were no major reports about voter intimidation, but it's just kind of like they could have kicked him out. Even looking at like the Atlanta mayor race where Keisha Lance Bottoms, a Black woman, won by just over like 700 votes. It's kind of like voting matters even more at the local level, because literally in those cases, every single vote counts. And it's just kind of like, I like when we see like the rise of like the Tea Party movement and like all of these movements that have now right-wing movements that have now taken over like national politics, do not be fooled. They did not start with a presidential election. They started by taking over state legislatures, over city halls, over governorships. And it was just kind of like, wow, before you knew it, yeah, we had a Black president, but the most of the governors were Republicans, and most of the state legislatures were like run by Republicans, because it's kind of like we cannot lose sight of the fact that change cannot happen if we don't start at the local level. Let's please not wait till 2020 to decide that like, oh, we want to run, you know, this like, you know, independent candidate that no one has ever heard of. Like, no, can we start making change now, please? Midterms are coming up this year. You know, let's show people. Do not get comfortable.
Yeah, I agree. We're definitely going to have an episode or two about the importance of being politically active, especially what we're seeing now in 2018 elections is around the corner. We're going to have a lot of discussions about that. And I think more specifically with policing, how we can make a change with local elections and local politics. I don't think many people know most of the cases we see with police involvement. Research them. Look at a lot of the popular ones and look why there was no verdict or why they didn't go to court. Most of the time it's because the DA is sending these trials or these cases to a grand jury. Look up how a grand jury operates. Okay, it's very important. Look up how a grand jury operates. Look up how DAs, district attorneys are put into office. Okay, 47 states, the DAs are elected officials in 47 states. Only in Alaska, Connecticut, and New Jersey are where they are appointed. That's important because district attorneys work hand in hand with police officers. Police officers get the bad guys, district attorneys put them away. Okay, and so when the police officers are the bad guys, the district attorney is supposed to put them away. And if you have a district attorney that is very, very lenient on police officers, it will give that institution more freedom to act incorrectly or act in a way that we don't expect them to act or hold them to the standard we expect them to be. And so really look at how the DA's office operates in your local district. Okay. And this is important because now you can have the power to elect a DA who, if instances happen with police in your community, you want a DA that backs not only the police, but also backs the community who elected them there. And by every means, the community far outweighs the police officers. And so your voice should be heard. But if we're not paying attention to this and we only want to react when things happen, like Daphne was saying, I think we can prevent that if we're constantly thinking, constantly being involved. And when any kind of election comes up, especially when you're trying to make change of policing, right? I think you really have to pay attention to the DA's office. So that holds police officers accountable, because if they know they mess up, they have a DA office that's going to at least put them in court and prosecute them or try to convict them if they are found guilty or if there looks like to be some mysterious things going on there. So pay particular attention to that moving forward. But, all in all, I think this is a great conversation. And, Daphne and I are definitely open to exploring more of the topics we talked about today. If there's things you want to talk about more in greater detail or have independent episodes on, we're definitely open to that. So just let us know what stood out to you most listening to this episode. Dav, how you feeling after that first featured segment of Black and Highly Dangerous?
I thought it was a really good and productive conversation. I kind of really enjoyed where we ended with some useful call to action for change in the future. So, I thought it was good, and I hope, our listeners gained something from our conversation.
Yeah, I definitely think that always trying to, and I think this is a trend most of our listeners will notice in interviews or discussion, that we're always trying to, at least either towards the end or somewhere in an interview or discussion, try to give you some practical advice moving forward, or whatever topic of how you can find more information, how this can be used, what you can do, whatever it is. Because we just want to make sure that you can leave here with something and not just an idea, but maybe some steps or an idea of some steps to move forward from it. But yeah, I think generally this was a good conversation to have. And of course, within an hour time frame, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So there's probably going to be some things that we missed, some things that you might want to hear more about, or some things we might have gotten wrong. So feel free to hit us up on the social media at BHD Podcast on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Email us at bhdpodcast@gmail.com. Go on our website. Whatever it is, if you feel like we got something wrong, let us know. Okay. And just don't give us, your feelings of why you felt why we got it wrong. Give us some facts, some evidence, that we can use to look up as well. Some resources. Just don't say I felt or I feel like this or I feel like that. No, we're trying to make sure we're having constructive and productive conversations, and just going off opinions and feelings won't get us anywhere. So we're open, and we'll definitely address it. And if we got something wrong, we'll own up to that and talk and correct it and let everyone know. It's not about always being right. It's about it's not always about being right. It's about, make sure the truth is out there, whatever that truth may be.
Yeah, I agree. We're definitely open to dialogue. We don't know everything, but just kind of like Ty said, keep feelings to a minimum, keep personal attacks to a minimum, and no fake news, real sources, please.
Mm-hmm. And on every post, on blackandhighlydangerous.com, you will be able to see the resources we post, YouTube videos, links to things that we discussed in the featured topic. So that's important for a lot of reasons, but so you can have it. So you're not just listening, but when you want to go back or you want to talk to somebody else about it, or you want to use it or post about it, there'll be a slew of resources there for you to look at and investigate further, if you will. But other than that, that, I'm feeling good. Episode 1 underway. I feel like that was a great conversation. We will be so eager. We're so eager and ready to hear your feedback. So please hit us up by all means.
Yes. And thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. Until next time.
If you're interested in continuing this and other conversations, visit our website, blackandhighlydangerous.com, to subscribe to our email list, suggest topics, and participate in our discussion forums.
Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BHD Podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast on your favorite platform. And as always, continue to be the oppressor's worst fear.